My marriage has been the happiest 4 3/4 years of my life. Unfortunately, I've been married for 5 years, as the old joke goes. We met when she started her own business, going to corporate offices taking care of watering and caring for their plants. When she came to my department the initial time, I fell head over heels for her at first sight. She had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I hadn't had much experience with girls. I was always shy. She was surprised and impressed that I was so young but had such a high position in a major software company. She was very curious and asked me a lot of questions about if the company gave stock options and when the company was going public. 6 weeks later she moved into my house, and 6 months later we married. I'm not handy around the house, and until recently that never bothered her. 3 months ago, my wife seemed to have decided that I wasn't manly enough. The definition of masculinity changes throughout time. As I said, I'm not much of a handyman. I'm certainly not an athlete. I never scored a touchdown, but I did score a 790 in my math college boards. My only current sport is chess. I'm also not much of a tough guy. I work with my brains, not my muscles, such as they are. I've only been in one fight in my life. It was in first grade and I lost, but to be fair, she was 2 months older and 2 inches taller than I was. She lost her temper after I told her that she had bad breath. I thought she would be happy to learn that so she could fix it. That painful lesson taught me to use my head and not my fists, and not to tell people the truth they didn't want to hear. I learned how to get along with people, which made the experience worthwhile, and this skill developed into a very well-paying career. I define my masculinity by my compassion, generosity and brains, not my brawn or eagerness to start fist fights. My wife used to agree with that assessment, but lately her opinion has radically changed and it troubles me. My wife recently said that a real man just takes what he wants and doesn't care what anyone else thinks. I told her that doesn't define a man but a sociopath. I think my marriage is in trouble. After my wife's hysterectomy 6 months ago, I spent over a month nursing her back to health without one word of complaint. My wife is now unable to bear children. I don't think that makes her less of a woman. I don't think my inability and unwillingness to beat the crap out of someone makes me less of a man. Some large thick bushes next to my house had become a fire hazard. I told my wife that I would hire a gardener to cut them down. Sarah, my wife of 5 years, sarcastically said that it was time for me to act like a real man and do it myself, so she rented a chainsaw for me to cut them down. Watching me struggle to do that was going to be her entertainment this weekend, along with watching me tack down the carpet runner in the hallway that had become unstuck. Every time you walked on the carpet you slid. If you weren't careful, you'd fall down the adjacent stairs. I was hurt by the way Sarah insulted me, and I told her. She laughed at me and said that if the shoe fits, etc. I left for work still puzzled and hurt by Sarah's insults and increasing lack of respect for me and my feelings. Lately she offered no words of love or encouragement, but instead responded to my words of love with insults, belittling me. It was as if someone threw a switch in my wife's brain about 3 months ago, and turned my formerly loving wife into a shrew. We hadn't been intimate since forever. She was never in the mood. She started eating garlic croutons before going to bed, and her garlic-laced bad breath drove me to sleep away from her on our living room couch. I begged her to stop eating those damn things, but she refused. Every day now I loved her a little less than the day before, and it broke my heart. I thought back and realized that the change occurred after my wife attended her high school reunion alone. She was the co-chairwoman of the event, and spent a month of late-night meetings with her committee organizing the shindig. She had been insistent that I not accompany her. I didn't argue with her because I didn't know any of those people. She rented a hotel room for the evening because she knew she would drink a lot and didn't want to drive or Uber home while drunk. Now I worried about who she met up with at the reunion, perhaps an old flame that she kindled. My love for her was slowly turning into hatred, and my caring was morphing into rage. I left the house early to go to work. I'm an administrator at a software company in Dallas, Texas. I applied for the job the week before I graduated college. I was the only job applicant among the 10 being interviewed who didn't have an advanced degree in computing or years of programming experience. When asked what accomplishment I was most proud of, I mentioned taking care of my autistic sister, teaching her to read and to become a little bit social, and to improve her personal hygiene habits. I also mentioned that I had taken college classes on teaching autistic adults. I didn't realize that this was the key to the job, and I was hired on the spot. My job is to make sure my high-functioning autistic staff do what they're supposed to do and motivate them to do it if they don't. I'll be the first to admit that it's a bullshit job. I'm really just a life coach for my team. But I earn a fortune, so I can't complain too much. Though I certainly am not a genius. I managed a staff of 10 men and women who are geniuses. They are as brilliant a group of computer programmers as you will find anywhere. They drove their 3 previous stern-by-the-book managers into quitting within weeks. Most of my staff are what's now called neurologically diverse. That's a polite way to say that they're savants on the autistic spectrum. Several of them are geniuses who can solve complex calculus problems in their heads, but haven't figured out the proper way to use toilet paper, which was why you could smell them a mile away when I started working with them. Personal hygiene is not important to some of them. Part of my job is to gently remind them to shower every day before they come to work, but after they've used the toilet, and to thoroughly wash their rear ends. Keeping them semi-presentable before they meet with clients or super wealthy venture capitalists is another important part of my job. Though I don't exactly admire these men and women, I do like them. They can't help the way they were born. None of them are mean or nasty. They are all kind, generous, and brilliant problem solvers. They're just neurologically diverse, like Sheldon from the TV show The Big Bang Theory. Unlike their previous managers, I was non-judgmental, kind, and patient with them. Our unit's productivity noticeably increased after I was hired, and our year-end bonuses reflected that. I wasn't my usual jovial self at work that day, and my employees immediately picked right up on it. That surprised me because picking up emotional cues from people is usually difficult for them. So I must have been way out of kilter. I decided that since these men and women each had astronomical IQs, I'd enlist their help with my marital problems. I laid out what was going on in my home and asked for advice. James said her eating of garlic croutons might be to push me away, or possibly she was just trying to ward off vampires. He pushed the bridge of his glasses up his nose, took out a slide rule and made a lot of calculations on it. He never used a computer. He looked up at me and said that there was a 42.5% chance that my wife was cheating on me. The others nodded. Several of them quibbled about the percentage, but all agreed that this was the likely reason for my wife's behavior after her high school reunion. James asked if my wife still had her high school yearbook. She did, I said. James said that the answer was in those pages. Ellen told me to search my wife's smartphone, but James disagreed. He claimed that she would have erased any incriminating evidence. Ellen asked if my wife was tech-savvy. She wasn't, I explained. Ellen maintained that her phone was where I would find the evidence. I responded that her phone was password protected and I didn't know the password. Robert, the youngest and most normal of the group, asked if my wife wrote down her password somewhere and told me to search for the list. James wasn't to be outdone and suggested that I install Wi-Fi cameras throughout my home and GPS tracking devices in my wife's car. As we spoke, Robert ordered all the spy equipment online with his own credit card that I needed and had it delivered to the office the next day. He also suggested that we switch cars and I followed my wife. As my way of saying thanks, I offered to take everyone to an expensive restaurant for dinner. They looked at one another and declined. They would have been uncomfortable at an upscale restaurant because they didn't really understand how to behave there. They were much happier when I suggested that I order pizzas delivered to our office. That night I returned home. I parked my car next to my wife's Mercedes and walked into the house with flowers for my wife, which I handed to her while she made dinner. She said thanks and continued to ignore me. I didn't even get a peck on the cheek. I went to the bookshelf in our wood panel den that held our various yearbooks. I saw that they were all covered in dust except for my wife's high school yearbook. I placed the spine on a table and allowed the book to open on its own. On the page to which it opened among all the photos there was only one that was signed. Dickie Rubin was the signed photo. He was a handsome guy and captain of the ice hockey team. He signed it. To the love of my life from your eternal boyfriend. Further examination of the book revealed that they were predicted to marry and my wife would become a movie star, while Dickie became a world-renowned ice hockey player who would be a Stanley Cup winner. They were also listed as the most affectionate couple at the prom. I took that to mean that they were intimate that night. The program for the recent reunion was in the yearbook and listed all the attendees, and Dickie was listed as one of the organizers along with my wife. So now I knew that they had spent several evenings a week together for over a month. My wife never mentioned him to me. A quick online search revealed that Dickie was recently married. He had signed a multi-year, multi-million-dollar contract with a local ice hockey team, which would begin in 3 months. I had everything I needed to suspect my wife's infidelity, but I had no hard evidence. I wasn't about to start World War III with my wife over my yet unproven suspicions. My wife's list of passwords wasn't hard to find. She taped it under her computer's mouse pad, and after opening her phone I learned that she indeed was cheating on me with Dick, her high school sweetheart and lover, until after high school when he left town for a Canadian college which had a great ice hockey team and didn't return until he was signed by our local professional team 2 months ago. Some people's bravery is fueled by alcohol. To the extent I could possibly become brave, it was fueled by my anger at having a cheating wife. I'd never been this angry in my life. The rational part of my brain lost out to the previously dormant, violent, vengeful caveman part that I didn't even know existed. The next day all the spy equipment arrived at my office. I left work early and returned home before my wife to set up the equipment. It was hooked up to our home Wi-Fi. I would be notified on my iPhone whenever motion was detected, but I never had an opportunity to use the equipment. My wife arrived later, much later, about 3 hours after her usual arrival time. She never called and didn't answer me when I called her. I didn't cross-examine her. Why bother? She would only repeat a well-rehearsed lie. I lied and told her that I had to go out of town tomorrow and wouldn't be back until after midnight. The trap was now baited. The next morning after I drove to work, I switched cars with Robert. I drove across the street from my house and parked under an overgrown weeping willow tree. I wore the obligatory baseball hat, sunglasses and fake mustache and waited. I listened to the ancient song by an R&B group called the OJs playing on the Oldies Motown channel. The name of the song was The Backstabbers. It seemed apropos. It was followed by What Becomes of the Broken Hearted. I watched my wife drive home early from work, followed by a newish Chevrolet Camaro SS convertible. A tall, handsome, muscular man who looked like Dickie from my wife's yearbook, but older and with a little less hair, exited the car and walked into the door of my home, which my wife opened. There was no outward display of affection, but that could mean that we're being discreet and didn't want the neighbors to see them kissing, or maybe it was just a friendly visit. I turned on my iPhone and tried to connect with the camera hidden in our master bedroom, but it didn't work. I waited a half hour and then walked around the side of the house to the master bedroom. Our house was built on a hill. You could enter the second floor from the top of the hill through a sliding glass door. The shades were opened enough for me to see inside. What I saw made me throw up. My wife, the love of my life, was face down with Dickie screwing her as they lay under the red silk canopy of our 4-poster bed. I sat down next to the bush that I was supposed to chainsaw down this weekend and tried to catch my breath. My nausea turned into red-hot rage. I silently unlocked the glass slider, then I picked up the chainsaw, primed it and pulled the starter cord. It started right up. I pushed open the door, revved up the chainsaw, and cut down 2 of the 4 wooden posters holding the canopy over the bed, and watched as the canopy collapsed on the cheating lovers. Through the noise of the chainsaw I heard my wife and her lover screaming. Dickie extricated himself from the fallen canopy and stood up. He was a foot taller than I was and much more muscular. He glared at me as I yelled at him that I was going to see off his Johnson. He was not only bigger than I was but a lot faster. He lunged at me and pulled the chainsaw out of my grip and into his hands. The balance of power had shifted against me significantly as he began chasing me while calling me a piece of shit. I ran out of the room towards the stairway. I may not be strong, but I am too fast. I was careful not to slip on the loose carpet runner. I made it safely to the bottom of the 5 steps and turned right towards the front door. Dick wasn't as careful. He didn't know about the loose carpet runner. He slipped on the loose carpet and tumbled down the steps while holding on to the still-running chainsaw. I heard a soul-piercing scream and watched aghast as Dick fell to the left while one of his legs, severed from his body, rolled to the right. My wife ran down the stairs still naked and grabbed her bleeding lover in her arms. I don't know how I had the presence of mind to do it, but I took a video of Dick still holding on to the chainsaw next to his severed leg. I didn't want the police arresting me for his clumsiness. As I focused the camera, I now saw that lying next to his leg was most of his Johnson. He wouldn't be screwing my wife or any other woman anymore. I didn't want the scum sucker bleeding to death in my house. I ordered my wife to jury-rig a tourniquet while I phoned for an ambulance and a police car. I never knew what a spiteful sob I was until that moment. As my wife stopped the blood flow with a towel as a tourniquet, I pointed out to Dickie where his Johnson lay as I took my foot and stomped on it, mashing it into nothingness. I guess the doctor won't be able to reattach it now. I taunted Dickie and my wife. I hope that lay with my wife was memorable because it was your last one now that you're no longer Dick, but Dick less in Dallas, and good luck playing ice hockey with just one leg. Dickie was in too much pain to respond, but my wife gave me the finger. I hope that you and Dickulus will be very happy together, I responded. I ran upstairs and hastily removed the hidden video cameras. I went outside and placed it in my neighbor's trash can while I waited for the police. I didn't want it to be used to prove premeditation on my part. The police questioned me for an hour. I explained that I returned home to saw off the fire hazard bush only to discover my wife and her lover. The chainsaw was still in my hand when I opened the glass slider, and that's when Dickie wrested it from me and attacked me, chasing me through the hallway and down the stairs. The police believed me and had a hard time suppressing their laughter. The next day I asked my wife if she was leaving me for Dickie less. She declined and said he had lost the only two parts of him that interested her, his Johnson and his lucrative hockey career. She showed no sign of remorse. She never apologized or tried to rationalize cheating on me. She suggested that we attend counseling to patch up our marriage. Now it was my turn to decline. I told her that I was filing for divorce. Because Dickie was a revered and famous local athlete, the story of Dickie and my wife made all the local TV news shows. My wife was a pariah in the city and moved to who knows where after the divorce. The last thing my ex-wife said to me as we left the courthouse was one last below-the-belt dig to stab me in my heart one last time. She folded her hands under her jugs and gave me an evil grin. Every word I'm going to tell you is true. First off, you're autistic and you're the only one who doesn't know it. That's why you do your job so well. That's why you never figured out that I never loved you. You were nothing but an easily manipulated meal ticket with stock options. I was willing to settle for you until the love of my life returned, and would soon have even more money than you have. She said she cheated because no woman would want to have children with an autistic weirdo like me, which means I'm not much of a man. I was furious and searched for the meanest thing I could think of, which would be the meanest thing I would ever say in my life. Well, by that logic, since you can't have children, you're not much of a woman. Her face froze. I turned and never looked back. When the divorce was complete, it cost me over $50,000 to rid myself of the cheating 304. It was the best money I ever spent. To celebrate my freedom, my team treated me to pizza and rented the movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They now affectionately refer to me by the same name as the chainsaw-wielding murderer in the movie Leatherface. Now let's start the second story. Most people believe in something or someone. My name is Dean, and coincidentally I believe in James Dean. He's my idol. He didn't have a cross or part of the Red Sea. He had a 1955 Triumph motorcycle, stayed out late and dated Natalie Wood. I know how to pick heroes. I like my heroes dressed in black. No sugar please. I first saw the movie Rebel Without a Cause on the late TV show when I was 10. I own copies of every movie he ever made, both of them. I do, however, prefer Rebel to his other film Giant. Years ago, my high school class visited Griffith Observatory. It was also a location in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. Another class from another school also visited it at the same time. I saw a girl who looked like a young Natalie Wood touring with her class. I walked over to her and asked her to marry me. She said her name was Ellen, and she laughed at me and said that we didn't even know each other. I quickly responded that we have the rest of our lives to learn everything there is about one another. I got her number, and 3 years later, in our junior year in college, we married. At the time, Ellen was 3 months pregnant. I had a part-time job cleaning yachts at Marina del Rey. It didn't pay very much, but I loved working on yachts. I was low on funds for a honeymoon. So using my keys we spent our honeymoon weekend on an 80-foot yacht, with the owner none the wiser. Ellen loved that we were rebels and outlaws. It really turned her on that we had broken onto the yacht. In her heart of hearts she wanted to be a bad girl. Then she said that maybe she should have married the ultra-wealthy man who owned the yacht. I was so in love with her that I didn't realize what a bad sign that was. A few months later our first son was born and my life changed forever. I was no longer the most important person in my world. I was a distant second to my son. As I held my 3-month-old son in my arms I cried tears of joy. I thanked my wife again and again for presenting me with this most wonderful gift. I loved her so much that I would gladly have died for her. Despite presenting them with a grandson, her parents hated me and that never changed. Her parents were very wealthy and paid for the rest of her college, and years later after our children were in school, they paid her law school tuition. I got a job at a weekly entertainment newspaper. I wrote movie reviews under one name, music reviews under another name, and restaurant reviews under a third name. The pay wasn't great, but I gained a lot of experience which eventually led to a job with a daily newspaper at a much larger salary. I also wrote freelance magazine articles. Though I wasn't making a fortune, I was proud that I made a very good living. We were happy and lived well, but not extravagantly on my salary alone. Things began to change once Ellen landed a well-paying job as a lawyer. 10 years raced by at warp speed. I was happy and thought my wife was happy. Her parents never accepted me because Ellen was pregnant when we married, and years later, after she got her first job as a lawyer, she always earned more money than I did. Her father took great joy in pointing that out at every opportunity. He even mentioned it several times to restaurant waitresses serving us dinner, even though I was the one paying for dinner. I'm proud of what I do. Though I never won a Pulitzer Prize, I was twice nominated for one. I felt that was a great honor, but my wife said it merely showed I was a loser. That comment stung for a very long time. When I wanted to buy a newer, larger TV set, my wife humiliated me in front of the salesman and said I took great joy in spending her money. Right after that I opened a new credit card and checking account in just my name so I wouldn't ever have to put up with her disrespect over a purchase. I didn't know what happened to the sweet, loving and kind woman I had fallen in love with and married. Ellen worked as a lawyer in a small firm and I was a newspaper reporter. We had 2 preteen sons, a minivan and a golden retriever. We looked like an ad for a typical suburban family on the outside. When the law firm for which my wife worked merged with another firm, our marriage went into free fall and I didn't know what to do. I tried to be a better husband. I frequently brought home flowers for her. She smiled and kissed me on the cheek, but that was the extent of her gratitude. I was attentive. I complimented her, but nothing warmed up her attitude towards me. I'm not ashamed to say that I was broken-hearted. I built my life around this woman. I showered her with love and affection, and I would be lost without her. I kept trying to come up with a plan to rescue my marriage. I'm a reasonably smart guy, but I didn't know what to do. Out of desperation I asked my sister. She said that once a woman loses respect or romantic interest in a man, there's no way in hell for him to get her back. Once her heart moves on, so do her reproductive parts. On the inside I could feel my wife, the love of my life, slipping away from me. She dressed more provocative than a lawyer should dress when she went to work. I searched the house and her car for clues of infidelity but found none. I thought there was a 50% chance she was cheating and a 50% chance that she had a hormonal imbalance and just lost interest in sex or even affection. We hadn't made love in almost a month, and I can't even remember the last time my wife told me that she loved me or kissed me. She worked late 2 or 3 days a week, which my children and I hated. Her cell phone and computer were always locked. She said it was because of lawyer-client confidentiality, but I had my doubts. The 2 new senior partners for whom she worked were 2 lawyers. That's redundant, I suppose. Perhaps lawyer is a synonym for a-hole? They were movie star handsome twin brothers who each looked like a young Robert Wagner. The few times I had met them they sneered at me, showing less respect than I would show a homeless person, while they were too handsy with my wife. I removed the hand of one of them from my wife's waist and asked if he wanted a sexual harassment lawsuit or something more painful. He accused me of threatening him with violence and told me to chill out or he would take out a restraining order against me. A restraining order won't stop me from sending you to a hospital if I learn that you're screwing my wife. I responded. He laughed in my face and said that if I earned as much as my wife or was a halfway competent lover, then I would have nothing to worry about. My wife said nothing in my defense. She was clearly on their side, not mine. Now I understood that we were at war. I was careful not to make any more specific threats against them. Now that I knew my wife would testify on their behalf if it ended up in a courtroom. Despite my protests and begging, my wife left on a sudden business trip with both men for 3 days and missed the elementary school graduation of our oldest son. She didn't give it a second thought. This crushed our son, and he ran out of the room crying when his mother told him that an elementary school graduation wasn't that big a deal and he should man up. He was 10 years old. How was he supposed to man up? She returned with a bad sunburn. I don't think they spent time in an office but on a beach. I was silently happy that she was in so much pain. I also noticed that there was no tan line where her wedding ring should have been. Obviously she hadn't worn it on this trip. Things returned to normal for a few weeks after she returned, but I refused to sleep with her until she had an STD test. That infuriated her, but she complied. I think that the thought of being infected also worried her. I tried to lower my anger and rage, from boiling to merely simmering. The only reason I didn't immediately divorce her was our 2 sons. In a few years they would graduate high school and I would divorce this 304 and be a free man. But secretly I prayed that she would stop screwing around and we could work things out. I know. I'm somewhere between an optimist and an idiot. My only defense was that despite everything she had done, no matter how angry I was with her, no matter how much I hated her, I still loved her and hoped that if I was patient, she would again love me. My wife Ellen was in our bedroom dressing for the Halloween or 10th wedding anniversary party we were hosting at our house. The theme was the 1950s, even though we weren't even born then. My wife was using a ton of spray net on her teased 1950s style hairdo, as she wore a vintage poodle skirt. She asked me to spray some of the highly flammable spray on the hair at the back of her head, but first cautioned me to put out the cigarette I was smoking because if the hairspray hit a flame it would act like a flamethrower. I was dressed as a magician. In my pocket was a lighter and several cigarettes. They were props for a few silly tricks I would demonstrate when everyone arrived. My naive hope was that this anniversary party might help us rekindle our love so that we could move on and forget the recent past. I hoped this party would help bring us back together. I arranged a slideshow on our big screen TV highlighting our years together with a slideshow. It was my not-so-subtle way to tell her what she was jeopardizing. Our close friends and coworkers arrived, and the scotch flowed like lava down a violent volcanic eruption. I hadn't invited Alan or Perry, but they were there anyway. That blatant disregard of my feelings made me angry. After my wife had more than her share of scotch, she was at first too chummy with Alan and Perry, her bosses, then she was too affectionate. There was too much touching going on between them, so I walked over and again removed Alan's hand from my wife's shoulders. Alan quickly put his arm back on her shoulder and loudly claimed that she wasn't my slave or my property. I again removed his hand and told him that I would have no problem breaking his arm if he put it again around my wife. Alan was furious and Alan was scared. Perry laughed at me and put his arm around my wife's waist. I raised my arm to hit him, but Alan, who was behind me, grabbed me and knocked me to the ground as he called me a cuck in front of all our guests. Ellen told me to merely acquiesce and accept that these 2 men were her lovers, and if I tried to divorce her, she would clean me out and take away my children while I paid enough alimony to ensure that I became homeless. She said the only reason she hadn't divorced me was because I was a free nanny for our children. Ellen, Alan and Perry laughed at me, then walked outside to the garden. In that moment I made 2 decisions. Now that I understood and had proof my wife's recent indifference and blatant disrespect was because she was having an affair with both men. I would divorce her despite her threats. No discussion, no second chances. My second decision was that I would wreak revenge on these men to salvage my self-respect. I didn't care a bit about my impending potential poverty or even sometimes being in jail. As I lay on the ground, I took out a cigarette and lit it with the 3-inch flame from my butane lighter to calm my nerves. I caught my breath and went into the backyard to find my wife. Neither she, Alan or Perry was there. I suspected that they re-entered the house and went upstairs, so I followed. I found Ellen being intimate with both on our bed. I raced over and tried to pull them off her. The nightstand fell over, knocking the alarm clock and can of spray net onto the floor. Alan knocked me to the ground and then Perry punched me in my nose, breaking it. Blood spurted out of my nose. Alan kicked me in my ribs, but since he wore no shoes it hurt him almost as much as my now broken rib hurt me. Then Perry straddled me, pinning me to the ground, and laughed at me as he tried to forcefully stick his Johnson in my mouth, while Alan tried unsuccessfully to hold my arms. I grabbed the flammable can of spray net in one hand and my butane lighter with my other. I lit the lighter as I aimed and sprayed the volatile, burning stream upwards into the naked scrotum and Johnson of my assailant. A flame at least 12 inches long scorched his privates. His scream could be heard in the next county. I turned towards Alan, who was also naked, and repeated my flamethrower act on his privates. I thought that Perry's screams were the loudest on earth, but Alan was much louder. My wife knelt next to Alan and was urging him onward to sexually assault me. Like a sadistic cheerleader, so the flames reached her face and hair also, which quickly went up in flame. I struggled to get up and then took a pillow to smother the flames on her head. I could see how badly her scalp was burnt, and realized that her hair would never grow back, and her face would show the burned scars for the rest of her life. Well, that was no longer my problem. As you reap, etc. The Bible had lots of good advice. I wish my wife had read it. I phoned 911 and requested 3 ambulances and a police car. I poured cold water onto my wife's head to ease her pain. "We can work through this," she said through her tears, as she looked at the pitiful excuses of what was left of her lover's private parts. "It was just sex. We can go to counseling." I was astounded by how stupid and trite her rationalizations were, but said nothing. I stood over the still crying and screaming men who lay on the floor. "Do your little pee-pees hurt?" I taunted them. "Well, I hope you enjoyed screwing my wife just now, because it's the last sex either of you will ever have. Was it worth it?" I don't think they could hear me through their moaning and screaming. I put on a big act of my pain for the police, claiming that I was attacked. My bloody face and clearly broken rib offered evidence of my innocence. The fact that both of my assailants were naked and burnt from their thighs up proved that I was on the ground, and they were over me when I lit them up. My wife never recovered from the humiliation of the burn marks on her face and loss of all her hair. Her 2 lovers went to prison for sexually assaulting me. When they were released, they had to register as sex offenders. Ellen tried unsuccessfully to escape the shame that followed her in town, so she finally moved to another state, and neither I nor our sons ever saw or heard from her again. My sons and their friends now referred to me as the Marvel comic book hero, the Human Torch, or just Torch for short. I wasn't a complete jerk and allowed my wife's parents to visit my sons, their grandsons. When they asked if I wanted to know how their daughter was doing, I thought of referring to her as Scarface, but I couldn't be that mean despite their treatment of me. Instead, I just said I have no interest in the woman you're raised to be a 304. My head was totally messed up by what had happened.